called, prior to the Paris Agreement actually saying that parties should come up with this work. And based on this, the European Union entered into two sets of commitments. First of all, under Kyoto for 2020, whereby we said we would reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 20%. We would also have a renewable energy target of 20% and improve our energy efficiency by 20%, all by 2020. We have achieved the greenhouse gas emissions reduction. We are virtually there on the renewable energy and well on the way there for energy efficiency already, so we're well on the way to meeting those targets. But again, with Paris and the Paris Agreement, we also realized we'd have to come forward with a new NDC. And here again, we took up the challenge of having a 40% economy-wide reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, half of which broadly comes from the power sector and industry, the other half which comes from the residential sector, from agriculture, from transport. Also renewable energy, and we've heard about the great strides in reducing the cost of renewable energy in India this morning, a 27% improvement, renewable energy target, and also a 30% energy efficiency target. Which brings us more now to what we do about HFCs. And this is really, again, we started thinking about this for the first commitment period for 2020, but also it became far more relevant for the period to 2030. And here we have the profile which we have legislated for within Europe, starting with a baseline for 2009 to 2012, but again, seeing the first step down in 2015, the second step down, which is a big step in 2018, going off to 2030, the end of the commitment period, whereby we are at 21% of our 2009-2012 baseline for HFCs. And bringing reality in, that is what our legislation said. This is what we set out to do. And this is the real position today. As you can see, interestingly, in 2014, there was a huge peak. And this was the year before the phase down came into effect. Not unusual. And there was certainly stockpiling by industry there. And I think this is what we've seen also for HCFCs in many parties to the Montreal Protocol. You see a peak just before the actual freeze or the phase down date. So I think this is the stockpiling aspect and what has happened in reality. But it's good also to see that the 2015 data shows that we're below our ceiling. And also the preliminary data coming forward for 2016, again, a step down, but again, just coming in within that ceiling. So proving what we have said, and when we came up with the legislation, we took a sector-by-sector approach. We saw what was possible, where alternatives were, in order to set these figures, and to work very much with industry, which clearly is something which is also happening today, working with industry in order to see where we would actually end up. Just to also give you some more graphs, and what is a very hard graph to read, but there are 4 lines on this slide, which set out the 4 profiles which the Montreal Protocol has agreed. The first on the left-hand side is that for developed countries. The red one slightly to its right is for other developed countries like Russia and Belarus and 1 or 2 countries like that who will have a slightly later starting date. And then on the right-hand side, the 2 phase-down schedules for developing countries. Respecting the fact that they're still using HCFCs, respecting the fact that there is a need for further time to adapt, and also reflecting the fact that these countries have very specific circumstances of high ambient temperatures, growing populations, etc., in order to allow them to have that growth, but also to meet international commitments and to also to phase down with the rest of the world as we are all doing. And I think just one important point to stress here, unlike CFCs and unlike HCFCs, we're talking about a phase down in this case, not a phase out, because we all recognize today that there are certain applications where alternatives are not yet available. And again, industry, and I hope research and development is ongoing to make sure that even in those sectors, that in time, alternatives will become available. Just to set, again, to put inside where we are in the European Union in comparison with the Kigali Amendment. The blue line, the lower line, is what we have domestic legislation in place for, and the red line is the Kigali Amendment. People will say, but why were you so unambitious when you actually were negotiating this in Kigali? I think it was a question which my Indian colleague asked on several occasions. Why are you so ambitious, unambitious in this case? And the reality is, and as we've heard today, perhaps the European Union is a bit of a leader in environmental matters. But also, we have to had to bring with us a number of other countries. Australia, Canada did not have domestic legislation in place for dealing with HFCs. Japan did, certainly. The United States had a very different approach. And so, we had to bring these countries with us to actually do the deal as well. And very specifically, whilst I said the European Union is actually going down and has peaked in HFCs, I suspect that the United States is still not necessarily growing, but it certainly had been growing in recent years, and so they specifically had a very big challenge to deal with this in the international negotiations. So we talked about the phase down of HFCs, but there are a number of other things which can be done to actually address the use of these gases. And these are issues which, in some ways, are common sense. And these are issues which, in the European Union, we were dealing with from our 2006 legislation, so going back over 10 years and well before the phase-out came into place. So you can do a lot to prevent emissions. You can have qualified personnel coming to service the equipment. You can have leak checks in industrial applications. You can have a system whereby, in terms of either voluntary or mandatory legislation, industrial applications actually check on a regular basis, is the system leaking? You can control byproduct production. So if gases are produced and there's a byproduct which is an HFC, that can be recycled or destroyed. You can make sure that when equipment reaches the end of its life, it is recycled in the appropriate way, either through producer responsibility schemes or consumer actions to bring used equipment back to shops where it can be properly dealt with. You can make sure that people are trained both for the servicing of equipment and the end-of-life treatment. And this is a growth industry, not just for the people who actually train the trainers, but again, if you actually upskilling people, they have the possibility to go out and increase their income. And certainly if you're going to have a 10 to 15% growth in domestic air conditioning units, there's a great opportunity there for skilled personnel to install the equipment, to service the equipment, and dispose of the equipment at the end of its life. So there's a great upskilling which is possible there. And again, information for users, the labeling of equipment, both what it contains, but also how energy efficient it is. And again, if we can get a system out there, a 5-star system, a 4-star system, a AAA system for showing that this is more energy efficient equipment, it really informs our consumers when they actually go and buy that piece of equipment at the beginning of its life. When they go to the shop and say, give me the most energy efficient, that is better for them. It reduces their energy bill. It also is good for the economy because it needs to produce less energy. We can also avoid the use, and again, this is where people can be trained to say, look, have you considered not using an HFC, or you can use another refrigerant. Certain applications we can say, there are alternatives available here, we should legislate and say you should not use it here. This is what we're doing in Europe, for example, in old things going back, what you should fill vehicle tires with, but also things like double glazing, and more recent things like what you should use in supermarkets when there are alternatives available. And finally, as I said, we can also deal with the phase down, and that is really what is very important. Also, as this is a green cooling conference today, I have to talk about the non-chemical aspects. And again, carbon dioxide is a refrigerant which we have used, I think, for over 100 years. It's being used today in many applications, more in the industrial applications in the European Union. For example, in supermarkets, we're seeing the use of carbon dioxide. But also, somebody mentioned HFO 1234YF earlier. One European manufacturer is still pioneering the use of CO2 mobile air conditioning units in cars. I think that's Daimler-Benz. And so, this is a technology which also has a potential there. Ammonia, again, used for many years, and we're having a speaker from the Ammonia Association later today to tell us what's happening in India. This is a technology, again, being deployed in industrial applications in the European Union, and it's certainly not a new aspect. Okay, we admit it needs specific training, specific control in its use, but it's certainly possible. Hydrocarbons, very much used in domestic applications. I think any domestic refrigerator bought in the European Union would have a hydrocarbon refrigerant in it today. And again, not something new, something which can be rolled out. But also, as we know, in certain markets we are having to confront the safety standards connected with using hydrocarbons. But again, this is something which, within the Montreal Protocol we're working on globally, but also something which we have to really convince industry to make that difference, to make the change in all the standard setting bodies so that this can be rolled out more widely. Water, again, an old technology, again being used in buildings in the European Union, and of course air. And I think this air as a refrigerant is being used specifically, still has been used for many years, but also is using specifically in some Southeast Asian markets and also in Japan. So there are alternatives out there today, and this is what we should also be focusing on, not just the low GWP, but also the alternatives, the zero GWPs. Finally, just to say that whilst talking about HFCs, talking about the alternatives, talking about the phase down is very important, there are also one or two things we need to think about when legislation is being introduced to tackle it. It's also the monitoring and reporting of the use of these gases, how we can gather the data properly, but also because there are huge trade flows both in the equipment and also in the gases themselves, we have to make sure that the appropriate customs codes are introduced, and this is something we're working on very much with the World Customs Organization at present, but also that our customs authorities are properly trained to spot these gases and equipment when they're being imported and exported to the various parties to make sure that all the aspects are being respected. Maybe we're not something to talk, but avoiding stocks, we saw the peak in 2014, but again, we have to think about the longer term here. And here we do have the longer term, 2028, 2032 in India. We have times to think about how we can make that transition more gradual, how we can make the changes come in earlier to avoid a huge upstocking prior to the actual 2028 freeze date, but also how we can avoid building up huge stocks of equipment now over the next 10 years, which will require high GWP servicing in the future. This is something already which can be thought about. The safety standards I've mentioned, and again, this is something we need to work on in all aspects, in all fora. This is not just simply a Montreal Protocol aspect. This is something which touches internationally, nationally, at a federal level, and also at a local level, because I was at an event yesterday talking about cities and urban aspects. Often cities themselves have the power to influence what is done in building codes, and therefore what refrigerants can be used, what equipment can be deployed when new buildings are put up. And this is something which I think also has to be thought through. And again, I cannot stress the need for training and qualification in this area. This is a long-term thing. It doesn't happen overnight. You have to set up the bodies and the organization that do the training, first of all, to train the people, to train the trainers, and then train the people in order to get them out there. And this is a long-term and expensive business. So, I'd like to thank you all very much for coming today. All of us look forward to a lively debate. There'll be plenty of opportunities this morning, this afternoon, over lunch to engage with all of us here to hear our views. I also hope that this is just the first step in a long and fruitful collaboration. We have in place a bilateral agreement with the Indian authorities to have discussions at a technical level. I hope that we can engage on these both bilaterally now, but going forward, and also to remain in touch with industry and with the stakeholders here in the multilateral fora, be it in the customs, be it in the standard setting, but also in the Montreal Protocol setting, because we've started a journey